We're recording. Okay. So, how are we getting on, lads? First off.
Pretty good, yeah. Pretty good.
Yeah, nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
Of course.
What's going on?
How about you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Oliver Goshey. I am the founder and director of Abundant Edge, as well as the Abundant Edge podcast. And I've worked in regenerative design for quite a handful of years all around the world for clients from everything from natural building projects to consultations for ecosystem restoration projects, and also even just at the home scale for people who want to improve the health of the ecosystems that they rely on for the benefit of themselves, their families, their communities, but especially the earth as well. And we're in a very unique moment in human history in which we have all of this understanding of how the environment works around us at the same time as we're destroying it at unprecedented rates. And so I'm trying to help to move the needle on the management of ecosystems in a way that is beneficial for many, many generations to come, while also showing that there isn't a compromise between treating the earth well and getting the things that we need out of it for our own abundance, our own quality of life, but expanding that to include all forms of life instead of just humans, which is quite short-sighted.
So a part of that is permaculture.
A big part of that is permaculture, yeah. It's one of the things that inspired me to get into this type of work to begin with, and it's a basis for a lot of the design work that I do.
And I think permaculture is such an amazing thing, and when I found out about it, I just wanted to do more research on it, but then we started a podcast, and I said, hey, I could get an expert on this, and here we are today. So Could you explain what permaculture is to anyone who doesn't understand what it is?
So permaculture is not necessarily one thing. My personal understanding of it is that it is a design science that aims to mimic natural systems in order to apply them to the way that humans manage the ecosystems around them and learn from sort of biomimicry and systems in nature that function incredibly well without any direct management from humans in order to kind of direct and better inform the things that we are trying to do with around us. But it also applies to so many other aspects of our culture. You can apply it to business, you can apply it to community management, you can apply it to politics, and there are ways of interpreting natural systems that can really inform just about anything that we do.
So that was a very complex answer.
Permaculture is a lot of things to a lot of people.
Yeah, to me, with very little understanding to it, it's basically mimicking a forest, or the side I've seen is this food forest. That's the part I'm interested in. So it's just basically, you ever been out to the woods? There's plenty of plants in there you can't eat. Now change that so you can. Like Willy Wonka's factory, but for plants.
Sure. And so that's a very common application of it. Usually permaculture is taught through the lens of gardening or farming or some kind of ecosystem management, right? It's kind of the way that it was most developed, and the way that it was developed by the founders, David Holmgren and I'm blanking on his name right now.
2 Australian guys, wasn't it?
Yeah, 2 Australian guys. I don't know why I always remember David Holmgren first. I'm terrible with names today. Oh, it'll come to me. Bill Mollison. There it is. Bill Mollison. David Holmgren and Bill Mollison.
Wow. So there's 12 principles to it, but unless you want to get into that, I'm not gonna.
I mean, I don't have them on fast recall. We can go through any of them that are of interest to you. But really, the thing to remember is that it's a design science. It's not necessarily one set of techniques or any one person's pedagogy. And like I said, it can be applied to just about anything, even though it has been most developed for ecosystem management.
Okay, well, I guess we'll talk about produce no waste. Now, I've seen people do that in a lot of ways, like if you have animals, use their the crap, or also if you have excess stuff, to just give it to people.
Right.
So yeah, how do you deal with producing?
So sharing the surplus is one of those principles that you talked about.
Yeah. Sound. I know people who are in horticulture, and even at that, they have to snip off like berries and stuff before they give off the plant, and you do that as well. So much stuff. When people talk about permaculture, what is not a permaculture?
Permaculture is not an extractive system, right? It's also not something that needs constant input or maintenance. We're always trying to move whatever we do into a state of self-sustainability. And sustainability is not a term that I like to use very much because I think it's very unambitious and very poorly used in a lot of the way that it's generally used in context.
What do you mean?
So sustainability really means to break even, right? So you're sustaining, you're just getting by. You're not doing good, but you're not doing bad. You're hitting like right in the middle, right? So when you talk about sustainability, when it comes to, business or any kind of sort of current economic system is usually what it gets used for, like sustainable buildings, sustainable businesses, sustainable communities and things like that. We're talking about things that are just breaking even or getting by, all right? So they're doing the minimum amount of damage that they can continue to do what they're set out to doing in perpetuity, so to speak. And to me, that's only progress if you're coming from a point of degradation. And that's where we're coming from most of our economic activity, right? Most businesses are designed on extractive methods, whether it's farming, whether it's mining, whether it's labor. It's all a matter of getting the most you can out of something without having to put anything back. And the reason why sustainability sounds cool is because it's the only way that we'll be able to continue this type of cultural norm if we want this to go on much longer, right? We're degrading our resource base in just about every single sense in which we're even touching it. And so sustainability is, like I said, only ambitious when you're coming from that point of looking at it. And I'm much more interested in regenerative systems, things that do more good than harm, that give more back than they take. Because when you are working from a degraded landscape or a degraded resource base, sustainability is not an option because the capacity for life in those systems is already super low, right? So if you've got a farm that's been tilled and that's been planted with corn or soybeans or wheat and sprayed chemicals on for a long time.
As a monoculture, there's normally only one crop in there.
Exactly. And even if those crops are rotated, right? You're not putting back the fertility or growing topsoil in a way that will allow you to continue to get value out of that piece of land if that's your goal. And that's kind of where most agriculture is at. Sustainable agriculture would be to put just enough nutrients back that you could continue to farm in the way that you're used to. But regenerative agriculture, which is actually, it's a series that I'm doing in the podcast at the moment, are people who are working to increase all of the ecosystem services and the health of the land that they're working on, not only so that they can continue to get a yield and get profit from that land, but so that it starts to increase in health and vitality and support more forms of life over the longest period of time, even past the point where humans are managing it. You see that difference?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hold on here.
It's a pretty big difference. Like,
take it away, Dara.
I can't take it away because I'm just blown away by the amount of things. Like I before the podcast, Jared was telling me like about food forests and everything, and I thought it was just such a cool concept. And now we're talking about like sustainability versus like regenerative properties of like permaculture, and it's just I'm overwhelmed with information.
It's easy to do, yeah.
I thought I knew a little bit about this.
It is a cool thing though. Like it's not like everything's going over my head, but like I'm just like it's a whole new thing that I didn't know existed.
Which is a great part about this podcast. We just learn the most random and most amazing things.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a huge part of the motivation for the podcast that I've had for the last 4 years as well, is that I'm fascinated to speak with the people who I have on the show and continue to learn and grow in my field and also expand out into new ways that I never would have known about without getting the chance to speak to these people. And Yeah, if I can share ideas that inspire people and get people excited about these concepts that to me are just like, there's nothing cooler than this. This is what I'm passionate about. This is what I love to learn about. This is what I love to teach about. Yeah, it's all the better, you know?
Yeah. Like if you're just thinking about this like, oh, just a bunch of plants. These are three lads talking about gardening. You're kind of right, but you're far from right.
Yeah. Well, so look at it this way. Like we talk about food forests, we talk about gardens, just because, you know, that's the way that most people know permaculture. That's the way it's most often applied. It's the way that most often talked about is, you know, growing food. And there's a couple of good examples to give of like what we're aiming for, right? So like, does anybody go into a mature forest and weed the understory or go and water the trees in order for it to grow?
Not that I've ever heard of.
Right. A healthy ecosystem does not need our support in order for it to continue to grow and expand in diversity and grow more resilient, right, as it matures. Every ecosystem has sort of a succession process in order to reach its fullest state of maturity. And in all of those ecosystems, there are disturbance patterns, whether it's storms, whether it's fires in a lot of like temperate rain or temperate forests. It could be heavy winds, it could be hurricanes, it could even be earthquakes, whatever it is, right? In a dynamic living system, there's always some form of disturbance. And when it does some damage to an ecosystem, it starts over from a successive process, right? So it needs to do some repair work. And that's usually when you start to see those opportunistic pioneer plants come in, the ones that we usually label as weeds and like to pull out. Well, those have a really specific use in the succession model of moving that ecosystem back into a state of resilience and optimal health or maturity, right? And so you can start to learn to read a landscape to identify what point in the succession it is. And if you do some research to understand what the fullest expression, what the fullest form of maturity that successional model is trying to move up to, then you can do things to help it along, right? So like those pioneer plants that I was talking about, the ones that we label as weeds and we always try and get out of our garden. Well, those are trying to improve the soil and improve the conditions for life so that the next level of plants that needs certain things, certain nutrients in the soil, certain hydrology, ability to hold water. Once those situations in the environment are available, then the next succession of plants comes in, right? And those prepare the site for the next succession after that, all the way up until it reaches maturity. Well, so you can help to skip steps. If you've got plants in there that are the types that have tap roots, you know, whether it's mullein or dandelions, you know, these things that we're always trying to get out of our lawns. Well, those put down really deep tap roots. They mine the soil down below for minerals and nutrients to bring back up to the surface. And they also open up the soil so that water can infiltrate down in there with those deep tap roots. What it's trying to do is improve the soil so that different types of plants can start to colonize the area and move on to the next succession. Well, we can help them do their job for them by adding compost, by watering, by putting in nutrients and starting to plant certain things that add other nutrients to the soil and jump past those successional models up to the mature forest that we want to get to, assuming that's where you are, because not every system is trying to get to forest, right? Just as an example. And so as you start to understand more about the ecology that you're working with, there's so much that you can do to kind of coax the maturation of the system, but start to guide it in a way that benefits your goals as well. So let's say the system is trying to move to a mature forest of some type. Let's say it's a temperate forest with deciduous and evergreen trees, kind of a dispersal of those. Well, you can select for the trees that give fruit or give nuts or have some type of wood that you want to harvest. You can select for plants that have certain desirable traits and help to grow those trees and keep them fertile and keep pests away from them so that you don't have to bring in chemicals. You don't have to constantly be weeding. And perhaps they even have a side benefit. You know, they attract pollinators or they enrich the soil in some way or keep pests away, right? As you start to guide that system towards where it naturally wants to go, but keeping in mind what you want to get out of it, everything can kind of move faster. And you're kind of only limited by the creativity and the knowledge of the person who's designing and managing the system. And when we're talking about food forests, that's really what you're trying to do. You're trying to create an entire ecosystem that once established, all you have to do is maintain it, which is go around and harvest, maybe cut things for mulch, maybe selectively prune trees so that they grow in a way that's conducive to the things that you want from them. And as it continues to grow, the system becomes more robust, it becomes more fertile, it supports more forms of life. And with more diversity, you get more resilience, and there's less and less that you have to do to make it healthy. And your biggest job becomes, harvesting and utilizing the yields from your system.
Give me a second.
Take your time. Did that all make sense? Am I repeating myself too much?
No, you're not repeating yourself. You're just talking science to a non-scientific man.
It's not terribly complex. It's really just a matter of how well do you want to get to know? Like, look, you could apply it to communities too, right? The same design criteria can be applied to a community or a government system or a business the same way that it can be applied to a forest or an ecosystem, right? So if you think about the members of a community, like the plants in a forest, each one has their own role. There are certain things in individual people that they like, that they thrive in. Each one has abilities and talents and skills to contribute. And each person can be managed in a way that, in the wrong circumstances, they can become destructive as well. And any kind of living system you can start to see it through this lens of pattern identification, right? There are certain truths through the whole thing.
I actually see it better in my mind after you personified it. So
yeah, and this is why it's useful to look at it through a number of different applications, right? Because certain people can identify with different systems more than they can, let's say, a forest, right? Some people really know business. And you can put in analogs or, I guess, equivalents of ecosystem elements and business elements, right? So maybe the profits that you're looking to get out of your business would be represented by the harvest that you would look to get out of a natural system. Maybe the different clients or regulatory bodies represent the climactic limits and the other players or other species in an ecosystem that have an impact and need to be managed in order to get the profit or the yield that you're looking to from that system. And this is why I like to think of it as a design science and not necessarily a way of gardening or managing a forest, because not everybody connects with it that way. And there are parallels in just about any living or dynamic system that we cannot fully control. And so the opposite of that would be like a technological system or a mechanical system, where it might be deeply complex or complicated, but it's not dynamic, it's not alive. If you start turning this gear, it can only have one possible outcome in the machinery that it's putting. Whereas if you plant a certain plant, or if you put a product out to market in a business, there's a whole number of consequences that could come out of it that you could not have possibly planned for, because life does what it wants, and you can coax it, you can steward it, you can maintain it and kind of guide it towards what you want it to do. But in a living system, you cannot fully control it. And the more that we try and control our ecosystems, or the more that we try and control our business or micromanage it, the more we get frustrated by sort of the emergent properties of what comes out of living dynamic systems, which if you remain open to them and you see yourself more in like a stewardship role, those unintended consequences can be really good things. They can be the feedback, the observation that helps you to get to know what you're doing at a much deeper level and avoid making sort of mistakes or getting outcomes that you weren't hoping for the next time you try something. And basically, it all comes back to this is the process of life. You need to manage it in your own life the same you do in ecosystems or in your garden. everything is unfolding and is part of a much larger system. It plays a role, you know?
Do you not think it's like super cool, like the idea of you're starting an entire ecology and you're keeping it going. That sounds kind of crazy to me.
It is, if you think of it as you're keeping it going. Because are you? Like, are you making it rain? Are you directing the microbes in the soil to break down organic matter and convert them into water-soluble nutrients that the plants can take up? It's like you're not really doing anything. And it's a really important part of being a manager in a living system, is that you kind of have to take your ego out of it. And it's frankly something that I really love about working with living systems. It's like, it's not about you. You might be a major player. You might be the person who kind of designed the system, but it's going to do what it's going to do largely regardless of what you want, right?
Yeah.
And you're more likely to get out of it what you want by taking the time to really be there and observe and learn and get to know all of the different complexities and nuances of your system, the same as your relationships with your friends or with your family. Like, you can hope to, get supportive friendship or loving relationships out of those interactions, but it's going to be directly proportional to the amount of time you spend listening to the other person and getting to know them well. It's going to be directly proportional to the input and the generosity and the compassion that you showed them, right?
Yeah.
And then, that would be like saying, well, my family or my friends or my girlfriend or whatever, they're kind to me because I manage them well. Well, okay, take your ego out of it for a second. Like, you played a part. Good job for not being a dickhead. Maybe that's why they're nice to you. But really, like, it's an emergent property of the person that they are. The same as it's an emergent property of getting a yield of fruit or nuts or vegetables from your garden. It's like, it was going to do that anyway. Good for you for not getting in the way of it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So is it like it's more towards guiding it? It's more guiding it towards where it needs to go, than kind of being over it the entire time and making the ecosystem do what you want.
Well, so look, there's obviously that way of managing it too. You can see gardens and you can see farms and you can see orchards managed exactly that way, where someone is like, I am going to get apples out of this orchard and nothing's going to stop me. And I'm going to spray down the entire place and put all the fertilizers and nutrients that I think it needs to get the thing that I want out of it, right?
Yeah.
And you can force it to do that, sure. But you are always going to be tied to that sort of micromanaging and, I guess, domineering way of managing the system. Like, it requires so much more energy and cost. And honestly, what you end up getting out of it is only the one thing that you thought you needed, right?
Yeah.
Whereas I can give you plenty of examples of really, really intelligent, enlightened people who have orchards, and let's say they're trying to get apples out of it, sure. But they plant a wide variety of apples. They're not just getting, let's say, Fuji or Golden Crisp out of it. They're getting a huge range, and they selected those trees for how they perform in their climate, not necessarily how much those things get at market.
Yeah.
And because they've selected, native adapted versions of the trees that they want, they don't have to maintain them as much. They're not as susceptible to being damaged by pests. They don't need the same inputs and constant maintenance as, say, some hybridized tree that was created in a laboratory and knows nothing about the conditions of your site. A lot of people even go around chopping down trees that, get sicknesses or require too many inputs after a couple of seasons. They're like, nope, sorry, this one doesn't work here. And on top of that, they take at least as much time cultivating the area for the health of the tree rather than managing the tree itself. So, like, a really good way of looking at kind of any productive ecosystem with a yield for humans is that a good farmer doesn't grow plants. Plants grow themselves. A really good farmer grows soil, right? If you have good soil, the plant is going to grow itself. It doesn't need you, right? It needs all of the tools for it to be able to do what it does. The same way your body doesn't need to be healed by something outside of it. Your body can heal itself if it has nutrient-dense food, if you're getting enough sleep, if you're not emotionally stressed. You know, all of these other factors that get in the way of us healing ourselves. It's the same with a tree or a plant or any other living system. Like, we have it in our DNA. We have it in our nature and our tendency to fix ourselves given the right circumstances, the right environment, healthy food, enough clean water, right?
Yeah.
But if you go around like trying to manage everything as a reactionary input kind of, it's like a very colonial mindset way of managing things.
Yeah.
It's a top-down approach.
Jeez,
Then-
colonialism and forests. I don't know how we got here.
It gets in everything. It really does.
Yeah.
And so,
go on.
yeah, just to finish up the point, like, if we can shift our mindset as to thinking that we're really the ones controlling this system, we're the ones that are making this happen, and start looking at it as like we are facilitators, we are stewards in a process that we are very much a part of and not removed from. Like, we are not a different species acting upon nature as if it were not a part of us. We are a big part of this system. And, you know, it's a shift in mindset. It's a shift in looking at how we manage things, how we are essential elements within them.
Yeah.
And it opens up doors and possibilities to a much more, not only like holistic and healthy way of managing things, but also way less energy intense and way less destructive. Like, you know, we were all able to feed ourselves, and we were in general quite a bit healthier, at least nutritionally, before we started forcing yields out of our ecosystems. Now that we have all of this deep scientific understanding and all of this, you know, technological growth since those times, we can return to that way of looking at things with new tools that can solve pretty much any of the problems that our society has at the moment. But it requires a change in thinking. It requires a change in identity in interacting with these systems.
I asked myself this question before we got on, and I wanted to hear your opinion on it. To an extent, do you think that food forests could be a solution to deforestation? Like, you couldn't go into the Amazon, start surrounding it with a food forest, and people walk in there. No, you're going to ruin the ecosystem in there. But to an extent, do you think it could help in certain areas?
It depends on the motivation for the deforestation. So, like,
Let's talk
people
about
aren't...
Europe. We've lost a lot of our woods over time because our ancestors, they just cut down trees so they can make boats and go take over places. So
Well, that's
Ireland,
it, right?
Ireland is one of the... I don't know. In all European countries, Ireland has like the least amount of a certain kind of tree. I think it's deciduous trees, because it was all cut down. So if we wanted to making more forests in Ireland, I think that might be a good idea.
Yeah. So
I said that really badly.
no, you didn't. I'm just trying to find the question in that I can help with. So you're absolutely right that the main motivation, as far as I understand it, for cutting down most of the deciduous forest was there was a huge boom in shipping. It was about 200 years ago, right? And a lot of the hardwood trees like ash and oak especially were cut down for boat building, and same in the UK. And y'all happen to have a climate there that doesn't necessarily bounce back quickly into forestry, if not sort of given a bit of a push, because it was very quickly converted into pasture land. And given how much rain y'all get, if you don't manage your pastures very well, if they're constantly being grazed over by animals that you know keep the shrub layer, the grass layer and stuff cut short, you risk getting very anaerobic soils where the acidity is increased. You get a lot of things like moss growing and taking over, and it's very difficult to start to grow trees in that environment, especially if there's a constant impact from animals as well, right? Stopping that succession from moving back. There's some really good examples of very effective reforestation efforts. I'm thinking of one specifically in Scotland. But it requires letting the land sit for a while without animal impact so that it can start to regenerate on its own. But there's also a lot of techniques that can be used for like replanting. And again, it requires that animals are kept off for at least long enough for those trees to grow to maturity that they won't be damaged by the animals. But it's not always as simple as just leaving the land alone and letting it regenerate, because depending on the circumstances around it, it won't necessarily move back into the same environment that you're looking for it to go back to without some help and some management from our inputs.
Yeah.
Undoubtedly, I mean, if that's the apex environment that Ireland should be moving back to, then by all means, it would be healthier to get that process started. But it's important to understand that like the political and the social barriers to making it happen need to be addressed before you just go start planting trees.
Why? I want to hear your opinion. Why?
Because if they're not valued, then who's to say they're not just going to be cut down the next time somebody decides, oh, well, we actually need firewood, or I need to build a house, or, you know, let's go back to building wooden boats, right?
Well, there has to stop that happening.
Is it? Because it didn't stop it from happening last time. If
Like,
it was so easy, like it would be happening more around the world, don't you think?
Maybe in Ireland, like Quilter owns most of the woods here. I couldn't go into a Quilter wood and start cutting down trees without major fines. I couldn't disturb that ecosystem without major fines. So I don't see why, if they made a big food forest in County Donegal, why would it be a big problem?
Yeah, I mean, I have to know the intricacies of that community. And in some communities, the value might be put on those ecosystems and moving back towards a succession of their maturation. And that's fantastic. I mean, more communities around the world need to be adding or need to be understanding the value of what their surrounding area could be if it was returned to health, right? Because this goes into so much more than providing food. Like a healthy forest does a huge amount for soil retention. It does a huge amount for carbon sequestration. It can hugely mitigate floods by absorbing the water into the root systems instead of having it all run off and erode the soils away. It's only positive. It's what that area of the world wants to be, like if allowed to return.
Like this map of Ireland here, we live in Eden, or I live in Edenderry, and Edenderry, its symbol, like its crest, is this area with loads of oak trees. But when the British were here and they were messing up the place, they cut down all the trees. There's no, as far as I know, there's no oak trees naturally in Edenderry anymore. And you can see this little map here of Ireland, and it's basically barren.
Yeah.
We got mined for our wood, and it's a shame the way it is. Like, I don't know any forests in Ireland that aren't just. Well, I've never been to one. I do archery in forest the whole time. I've never been to an archery club or event that was in the woods and it wasn't like a Quilter woods. Like, nearest wood to me is Rahan Woods, and that was just set up for forestry. It's going to be cut down eventually.
Well, so that's the other thing, right? So there's a lot of different ways of reforesting an area, and not all of them are very beneficial. I actually did a whole series on the podcast on reforestation and agroforestry, and I wrote an article about like the most important things to know about forests around the world. And a lot of it is that, you know, it's a really kind of trendy thing right now to have reforestation or tree planting initiatives, right?
Yeah, they're like big. I think Mr. Beast did, plant 20 million trees.
20 million trees, yeah.
He didn't do it, he was part of it.
Sure. I mean, there's the 1 trillion tree effort. I can't remember who started that. It's part of the article that I wrote.
Or Ecosia. If you do a certain amount of searches, they'll plant a tree.
See, now, Ecosia is a really good example. And I did an interview with their chief tree planting officer. And they have in my opinion, they have the best approach at reforestation that I have seen out of any of these sort of nonprofit entities.
Love those guys.
Yeah. I wholeheartedly support them. I recommend them to anybody. I use Ecosia myself.
They're
They
very open. They
planted.
show everything they do.
That's a huge part of a regenerative enterprise is transparency, right? How are you going to hold them accountable if they're hiding their information? So the difference between them and a lot of these other reforestation efforts, and you'll see like national level, like China did a huge green belt planting along the edge of the Gobi Desert in order to try and stop the advancement of desertification from that area. And it was hugely successful by certain metrics. They planted a ton of trees, but they didn't take as far as I understand, they didn't take the time to understand what native species needed to be planted there. And so I think they planted a lot of like eucalypts. And those are hugely water-intensive trees. They grow extremely fast, which is a big advantage, but they put down massive root systems, and they like dropped the water table in that area something frightening, like, I don't know, like 100 meters or something, growing all of those trees. And now all those people who were relying on well water or, irrigation from that area are now all without water. And once those trees suck up, past where their roots can grow, they're not going to remain. There's also a lot of reforestation efforts that are simply for timber. And so the trees at most are left between 30 and 60 years. Yeah, and they're all planted in these crazy rows. And for the most part, they only plant, it's a monocrop. It's the same, like I've heard them referred to as green deserts. There's as much, species diversity in one of those as there is in a desert. But it looks all green and lush, and so people are like, yeah, reforestation, we're making progress. Are you, though? Because those things are hugely susceptible to plagues, and like the example that I've seen most like is in the United States, where all these pine plantations for timber they got decimated by the Japanese boring beetle. And you can see entire landscapes in the mountains and such that are all just dead timber, kindling basically. And it's stuff like that is a huge, huge risk for massive forest fires. And they're susceptible to all the exact same problems as, 4,000 acres of corn. When you plant just one species, anything that can eat or attack that thing is just going to proliferate massively because nature doesn't do monocrops. It's entirely unsustainable. It's one of the most, weak and brittle ecosystems that you could possibly force on a landscape. And we don't think about it when we see lush green forests, but it's exactly the same thing.
Yeah. So we've kind of gone on the negative side of our stuff that's going on at the moment. Let's do a little bit of positive stuff. I don't know. I kind of phrased that badly.
No, I'm with you. I'm all about focusing on the positive. It's just sometimes you got to give a little context as to where we're coming from, right?
Yeah, of course, definitely. Yeah. Say Dara here, who's been very quiet all episode. If he wanted in his little back garden, which is, how big is your garden, Dara?
It's actually, in terms of like a back garden, it's pretty big. Like I'd say like maybe. Well, there's like 3 different gardens or 4 different gardens. And like the biggest one is maybe 5 meters by like 20.
Let's say little Dara over here, the angel he is, if he wanted to set up a tiny little, I guess you couldn't really call it permaculture, like a perennial garden even, or like a food forest mini version, whatever. What would you recommend to him? Like, what could anyone do? Or what could anyone grow in temperate climates with a high yield?
I mean, it depends. So everything comes back to context. And this is why it's difficult to give answers and techniques in permaculture, is because everything depends on context. What are you trying to get out of your garden? Like, what do you most eat? What do you know that grows well in your area? Because a temperate climate is a huge, huge, huge variation of subclimates, A temperate climate can get a ton of rain. It can be, borderline arid. It has more to do with temperature.
Well, we definitely get the rain part of it.
Yeah, you do.
Oh, yeah, 100%. It's not. It never stops raining here.
So probably tomatoes is going to be a bad choice for you, right?
Exactly.
They get mold and they get fungus really easily when their leaves are wet. Whereas where I'm here in Spain, my tomatoes are doing fantastic because it hasn't rained in a while, and so I'm only giving them water down at the base of the plant, because if I watered the whole thing, it'd start to rot. So tell me more about your personal context. Like, what do you want out of a garden?
Go on, Dad.
And like,
What do I want in the garden?
yeah, what do you want out of your garden, and
What do you
what
like
have
to
you
eat?
seen work?
Well, like, I don't really plant stuff. Like my family, we used to plant like herbs and stuff like that, but it's nowhere near like kind of what we're talking about. But in terms of like things that I think we could plant here would be like just kind of tubers and stuff like that. So like potatoes.
Like potatoes grow anywhere here. You can
Yeah,
grow
exactly,
in the front
yeah.
garden you wanted to. I'm growing potatoes right now. They're going fine. I have terrible soil.
So
Wow.
is potatoes mostly what you want to be eating, or do you want to grow
Yeah.
things that maybe aren't the cheapest thing? Like,
We
for
are not
me,
confirming that stereotype, by the way.
I'm sorry.
gonna
We're
say,
not
like-
confirming the stereotype, but I do love potatoes. I'm sorry.
I was going to say, you're setting yourself up for another famine, my friend. But we'll see you over in America.
I'll be over there. Don't worry.
Yeah.
God.
So, like, if you're working from a limited space, yeah, it's definitely a good idea to start from what it is that you like to eat. Don't grow something that you're not going to eat. That's a waste of time. If you love eating potatoes, as much as I don't want to play into that stereotype, great, grow potatoes, but like, grow 5 different varieties or 10 different varieties of potatoes. Not only will you get a larger nutritional profile, but you'll figure out which ones grow better in your soil than others, right?
And which tastes better.
Yeah, which tastes better, sure.
Exactly.
And certain ones grow better at different times of the year. Some of them grow better in different types of soil with different amounts of water.
Yeah.
Like, no one plant is one thing, and microclimates and soil types play in a lot, and those can vary, by the foot or by the meter on any given site. And so this is why getting to know your context is so important. The other thing I would say about growing a garden is, like, how cheap are potatoes at the store? You're never going to, like, it's never going to come out as a financial savings to grow potatoes, because they're so bloody cheap in the store that, like, the amount of time that you put into growing them, if you priced it out per hour or whatever, you're going to end up spending way more just by spending time growing that food than if you bought it. Now, granted, there are a ton of other benefits that make it worthwhile to grow your own. It's not just a financial exchange.
Yeah, I was going to
But
say that.
I would put my efforts much more into, things that you really want to grow, things that are either hard to find or are really expensive in your area. And then from there, start to narrow it down by what grows well in your climate, what grows well in your soil, and any other goals that you would have for that. So, like, maybe if you've got some sort of illness, or if you have some sort of like vitamin deficiency. Sea berries was a great example that you were talking about before this interview. Is like, the nutritional profile of those is amazing. It's a
I really want to
perennial.
grow those.
Yeah, it does a whole bunch for the health of your soil. And because it's a perennial plant, like, you don't have to go back and till the soil or replant it every year. It's
Look how
a
beautiful
much
that is.
healthier thing to put into your landscape than, something that's going to die after a couple of months. There's a lot of benefits to looking for perennial equivalents to the annual crops that you're used to eating.
Yeah.
Plus, they're a lot lower maintenance. Once they get established, it's mostly pruning, a little bit of weeding, and harvesting. Whereas it's so much more work to raise annual vegetables.
Yeah, that's one thing I learned about pretty early on when I was doing a bit of research. Was I didn't even know these were a thing. I never even thought about it, like perennials. And
There are some really, really great resources on perennial vegetables that can substitute the things that you're used to eating the annual forms of. There's like 4 or 5 different versions of perennial onions. So you don't have to till the soil. You don't have to, deal with those kind of fiddly things depending on how well they grow in your area. You can get like Egyptian walking onions and all kinds of really cool ones that give a yield, in their season.
Could you explain to me real quick? Because I've seen this before, Egyptian walking onions.
So I haven't actually managed to grow those myself. The main difference is that they're perennial and that the bulbs come out on the top. They're not underground. You don't have to pull them out.
That is so much easier.
Well, they're also really small. So if you're used to eating little shallots and stuff, then why not grow Egyptian walking onions? Because they'll start to kind of creep out and colonize a whole area. And, you'll see them. The bulbs form on the top of the plant, and you just go picking them when they're ready.
Yeah. Also seen...
There's even like air potatoes, which I don't think will grow in your climate, but they're a vine. And just like you're used to getting fruits. Have you ever heard of air potatoes?
Air potatoes.
Yeah. I don't know that those will grow in your climate, but they're a vine. And they put out a fruit, much like you would think like a kiwi or something, about the same size. But they're essentially potatoes. But they're not a root.
Do they taste like potato?
I have not tried one myself. I just have heard them recommended. And I think they will grow in my climate here in Catalonia. And so as soon as I get myself a piece of land where I'm going to be for a little while, that's definitely something I'm going to be trialing.
So cool. Oh, yeah, Catalonia is a cool place. We were there before. And
where is it?
Barcelona.
Yeah. I'm about 30 minutes north of Barcelona. Really beautiful area.
What was the other place? We were in a place started with an S.
Sitges?
Where Portaventura is. Or no, what is it? Hold on. I think it's a cool place anyway. Yeah,
I mean, I've only been here for just about a year now, and I could spend I've been traveling my entire life. I've been very fortunate to see a lot of the world and to work in a lot of really cool places. I could probably spend the whole rest of my life just traveling around the little towns and seeing all the incredible scenery and trying the different regional foods around here and never get bored.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but do a lot of people there want independence?
Yes, there is still a big independence movement here in Catalonia. Yeah.
That was very prevalent when we were there. It was...
Year 2017, yeah, that's when the succession vote happened. There's still quite a few political prisoners in Madrid for what happened then.
We had foreign exchange students, and I think both of them were from there, and I could be wrong. I know one of them was for it and one was against it. So, yeah.
Yeah, I've got some friends that are on both sides of that. My girlfriend, my partner here, is not for it, but some of our friends are very nationalistic and are very much secessionists as far as the political spectrum goes. And I definitely see both sides. I definitely understand the amount of oppression that Catalonia has received from Madrid's central government, especially since the Civil War, to the point where it was actually illegal to speak Catalan here up until, I believe, the 70s. If not later.
Which is such a damaging thing for a language. Irish was illegal for Irish people to speak, and only 1.7% of the population speaks it now. It's the least spoken Celtic language.
Yeah, it's really unfortunate. It's a tragic thing to do to a people. The fortunate thing is that the Catalonian government has done a remarkable job at keeping the language alive here. And I feel like it's part of my responsibility, if I'm going to live here, to learn the language. I've made some efforts, but it definitely is easier getting by in Spanish because everyone speaks that as well. But it's definitely a big goal of mine as I, get more acquainted with the area and kind of put down some roots here, is getting a grasp on the language.
I say the Mediterranean is probably a great place to be growing stuff at the moment. That's a perfect climate, nearly. Even for your health, it's a great thing.
I mean, so it totally depends on what you consider perfect. Every single place has its difficulties, right? Here, water security is probably the biggest issue because we don't have very massive weather events. We don't get like typhoons or hurricanes or, it's not very seismically active. So before I moved here a year ago, I was living in Guatemala, where we would get hurricanes, volcanoes, earthquakes, torrential downpours, and
Kind of crazy.
yeah, it was one of the craziest, like most just active geologically and climate meteorologically areas that I've ever lived in. That being said, with all of those disturbances, I think it's number 4 or 5 on the most biodiverse places in the entire world. So there's trade-offs, right? Someone might consider the perfect climate somewhere that's like sunny and dry and warm all the time. Well, depending on where that is, that might be a desert. Like a lot of people go to retire in Australia or Arizona, and for them, that's the perfect climate. But as far as like biodiversity and food security or water security, there's some compromises.
For you, what's the perfect climate? For what you want to grow, your needs, so on. Specifically you.
I am very adaptable. First of all, I have never tried a food that I have rejected or that I don't like. So I would be happy with pretty much any cuisine, right? And I would just go around adapting it to my needs, figuring out what I could grow in a place. I long ago gave up the idea of a perfect climate. I really think that pretty much anywhere is like what you make of it. Granted, there's different limitations and such, and it's a huge uphill battle if you're trying to do farming or anything like, say, in the Arctic Circle or in the Sahara Desert. There's some major limitations. So to me, it's not really a question of perfect. It's like, where would you not be able to do what you wanted to do? And so farming definitely farming in basically anywhere between the tropics all the way up until about the Arctic Circle, which, I mean, granted, there's some very successful farming done in that area. In fact, if you want to see an amazing example of regenerative agriculture, you just have to look at, let's say, Richard Perkins, who's up in northern Sweden, and they've only got about 3 frost-free months out of the year. And he's turning over $250,000 in produce that comes from a market garden, from perennial tree systems, and eggs and chicken and other meat products in a 6-month growing season.
Just talking about that, you can really grow anywhere. We had a guy on 2 days ago. It's the only rooftop farm in Ireland at the moment, Cork Rooftop Farm. Such a cool guy, has chickens up there and has plans for bees and pigeons.
Yeah, it's fucking insane. Like,
oh, cool.
It's it really shows that you don't have to have too much space to actually start your own kind of system.
Like when he got on this thing, it was literally just a rooftop with a bunch of crap on top of it. It turned into this amazing place.
Yeah, it's really
That's incredible. Good for him. I mean, so this kind of comes back to what I had mentioned a little bit earlier, is like humans are kind of the limiting factor in most of our design efforts. If we're talking about permaculture design, right? We're limited by our own imagination, our own understanding of the ecosystems that we're working with, and our own, I guess, utility or inventiveness when it comes to applying the things that we know. And within that, there's actually a lot of freedom too, because, at this point, we're seeing all the damage that's been done to the natural resources in our earth and thinking, oh, well, like humans can only be a destructive force on the land. Well, with all of this power, with all of this understanding, with all of this technological ingenuity, there's just as much potential to be a catalyst for the most impressive planetary regeneration that you can imagine if we got
we
all of our
crazy.
Yeah, well, there's people doing it with like no resources as an incredible example. Like if we just got on the same page and be like, whoa, okay, everybody hang on. This isn't going in the direction that we want. Let's start to steer this ship in a new direction and start to like collaborate instead of constantly butt heads and like selfishly try and hoard resources. We could turn this around in no time flat. Now, we're talking about very different things than like, making trees grow. We're talking about societal and cultural shifts that need to happen. And, people would go into the spirituality of it.
Now, there's people who don't believe in climate change. There's people who probably believe that permaculture is a joke. Like it's a hippie thing. There's always been people against
Oh
it.
yeah. And so like depending on where you go around in the world, and because I've worked in
Like-
so many places, I can attest to it. Permaculture is thought of very differently depending on where you go. Some people think of it as like this hippie thing that people are just, planting these kind of weird, kind of messy gardens with a whole bunch of inefficient plants all close together. And in other places where people have applied permaculture to like really productive, really beautiful, profitable systems, it has a much different connotation or sort of cultural association. So it really just depends.
Yeah. You ever gotten any slack for doing permaculture? Some like just uneducated guy or gal?
I think it just depends on like what you think of as permaculture. So I've gotten slack from people who think permaculture is one thing.
Yeah.
But I
Well,
mean,
like their definition is different to yours.
exactly. Like permaculture is a design science. If you're criticizing the way that I apply it to a garden, then, that's your prerogative. But
There's bigger problems in the world than how you make a garden.
Yeah,
Yeah,
like I
I
feel
mean,
like
there's that.
people tend to like kind of make light of or like kind of make fun of things that they don't fully understand,
Yeah.
Yeah,
and then
definitely.
they'll start to understand it, and then they're just like, oh right, why was I making fun of this?
Well, so here's the biggest problem that I see in permaculture from the different opinions that I've heard for 4 years on the podcast, as well as all the feedback I've gotten from listeners and people that I've worked with and collaborated with. Just like any kind of pedagogy, any kind of, kind of system of looking at the world, there's people who look at it dogmatically and narrowly. And it's like, these are the set of rules. This is the way you have to apply it. If you don't do those things, it's not permaculture, or it's not Christianity, or it's not communism. It's like whatever your thing is, based on how you define it is how you're going to judge other people. So the most of the flack that I get from people who are like, no, you're not doing permaculture either right, or you're not doing it to its full potential. It's all defined about what they consider permaculture to be. Now, the people who I really appreciate criticism from are like, hey, have you considered this? I see you applying this thing that is taught in permaculture, or I see you testing this system out, or I see you teaching this one methodology. I've found that this works better, or like this is limited. It comes from people who have a broad definition of the topic, and not the people who are like, oh, well, you need to put swales in every landscape in order to harvest water. It's like, yeah, those are useful in certain contexts. But like, I'll tell you right now, if you continue to study like any other kind of system of looking at the world, and again, we'll use permaculture as the analogy here. If anybody starts to tell you like the thing to do is this without really understanding exactly what your context is, that person doesn't understand what permaculture is very well. All of the best permaculture practitioners with the most experience, with the most wisdom that I've ever talked to, whenever I've asked them a specific question like, how would you do this? Or what advice would you give to beginners? I get the exact same answer from pretty much all of them. And that is, it depends. What is your context?
Such a frustrating way of saying it.
It is a really frustrating way.
But you're right. You're entirely right.
It also puts the responsibility on the person who's designing. I know it's really convenient to say, like, I just want somebody to give me the answers, because what it does is it takes the responsibility away from you if it goes wrong. And I know that can feel better, but it's not helpful, right?
Yeah.
So I can tell you, look, for you to go plant a food forest, what you need to put in is cherries and elderberries and sea berries and apples and pears, and you need to plant an understory of comfrey, and I can give you the prescription from what I think of from my own like understanding of your ecosystem from a distance, but I don't know your microclimate. I don't know what you like to eat. I don't know how much time out of the week you have to maintain these systems. I don't know what your budget is, which is why I am able to offer my systems as a designer from a distance, but I can't give you actual prescriptions. What I always end up doing with clients instead is walking them through becoming the designer themselves. And I'm actually in the process right now I think it's going to be this upcoming month or 2 months from now. I'm releasing an audio course on how to create a regenerative design for yourself. Because no matter what or how much experience or knowledge that I have, I can't create a better design for you than you can. What I can do is I can guide you to think through the process holistically and really get to understand your context so that the decisions that you make are well informed and well thought out. But I'm never going to get to know your context better than you will. And that's the same as someone practicing a religion. Like Christianity or Islam is going to mean something different to somebody dependent on how they were raised, what that religion meant in the country where they are. If they are studying Islam and they grew up in the Middle East, they're going to understand it very differently than somebody in Indonesia or Malaysia because of all of the cultural differences, the history, even the climate, in which those things are taught. And so by giving like direct prescriptions or techniques for somebody to follow should always be looked at as adding tools to the tool belt and not a prescription for application. The only way you're going to be able to do this effectively is if you take on the responsibility of being the designer and the responsibility of getting to know your context as deeply as you can, because it does so much more than create good food forests or gardens as a result. It makes you a better listener. It makes you a compassionate observer of your ecosystem. It makes you a better member of your community. Like, there's no way of designing holistically for a regenerative system in which you don't make yourself part of the process. So if you're trying to heal a landscape and you forget to heal your own emotional or spiritual health, your landscape is going to suffer from the blind spots for having not considered yourself part of that ecosystem. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So like this is a lifelong journey, and you can see it through the lens of a garden or a food forest or a reforestation project, but you're a part of it whether you want to be or not. Your own mental and spiritual and financial limitations are going to be the limitations of the creativity and the ecological health of what you're applying it to. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So like it gets deep, and
It does get very deep.
I'm much more excited about teaching people how to take on the inspiring sort of stewardship role that this can become, because it's transformative for your entire life. Great, you're going to get some apples and some good berries out of it in a couple of years, but you're also going to be a very different person by the time your system starts to mature, because you as an individual, you as a member of a community, you as a member of an ecosystem is going to evolve with your design. And I just find that so inspiring, because as I've done it for clients, it's had an effect on me so it's like I almost evangelicize this information, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's definitely a great thing, especially if you excess. Like, Dara, if I came down to yours with a bag full of seed buckthorn, you wouldn't know what to do with it. It would be a nice gift.
Exactly.
And then there's also the benefit of like you're eating healthier foods. You're more plant-based. If you're concerned about like your meat intake, you're eating more plant-based because, well, you're growing plants left, right, and center. Like, so you may as well be.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you're less reliant on the store.
Yeah,
so that's a huge part of it.
How much of your own food do you grow?
At this point, I look at it more as like the whole community that participates in my food. I live in an apartment at the moment, which is
I understand.
It's a huge change from living on a half-acre permaculture demonstration site in Guatemala where I was a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
And so it's been a big adjustment for me, because though I've taught a lot of people living in apartments and in small houses without yards or whatever, how they can be more sustainable, how they can be more self-sufficient and connect with nature, it's really interesting for me to go back, like, from what I had access to myself and start to apply a lot of those things that I've learned since I had more land. Now, there's a lot of things that you can do to get access to more land. For example, I am borrowing about a 50 square meter plot at a neighbor's place, about a 10-minute walk from here, in a hazelnut orchard that she wasn't using. Is a grandmother of a friend of my girlfriend's. It's like a couple steps removed. But from there, that's actually where we're getting most of our produce right now. And my partner, her parents grow a pretty impressive garden every year. They don't have a lot of diversity, but like pretty much all the tomatoes that we're going to eat between now and the spring are going to come from our garden and her dad's garden.
That's really
and
nice. That's really
so
good.
like it's about creating a network. And this is one thing that I always tell people, because I get so many questions about like, how can I grow all my own food?
That's a big deal in the first place.
It is a big deal.
I know the guy Rob Greenfield did that, and he was having a couple problems. Also, he wasn't growing all his own food; he was foraging as well.
Which is a really important element of that, right? I really look at it more as like, where do you want all your food to come from? Because I neither have the space nor the time nor the desire to grow all my own wheat, but I do bake all my own bread at home. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It's like, what part of the process do you want to take on yourself? What part of the process do you want to accept for what it is and just try and get it from the best source you can? And what part of the process do you want to create community around? So, we're pretty dependent on my girlfriend's dad for tomatoes, but like he's happy to give them to us. He plants like 6 times more than he needs every season, knowing that we're going to eat them. The same way as this is my first year of growing a garden here in the Mediterranean, and I've been experimenting with a whole bunch of things and adding more things into the garden that I know that they like, but that they don't eat very much, so that we can start sort of a mutual exchange and support each other as, we go through different seasons and we eat seasonally and, try and get more of our food from the local community and the best sources possible. Now, Rob Greenfield is a fantastic example, but it's worth knowing that he spent what equates to a full-time job worth amount of time, like 40 hours to 60 hours a week.
Yeah, he doesn't really have a job. He just does this.
Working on food.
He's an activist.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a perfectly legitimate way to live. I'm very much supportive of it.
Knock it.
No, absolutely. But like,
Someone's
he's very clear about you couldn't have a full-time job and still be able to do this. You know what I mean?
But look how
it's
much,
a massive.
Like, this is his front and back garden. This is everything he's eaten for a year. It's going to be very difficult to grow all your own food. Like, he did it with this amount of space, and even at that, it's huge.
Yeah, and like you have to be very careful about figuring out what you mostly need in a diet. What
dietary problems.
Yeah, and so what a lot of people forget when it comes to like growing a garden is most of your calories are never going to come from vegetables. I don't care how much you like veggies. You're going to need starches. You're going to need carbohydrates, right? So he really talks about planting things like yucca and sweet potato and pumpkins and stuff that are really carbohydrate rich for the energy that you need to get through your day, because vegetables are not rich in that stuff.
Yeah.
So yeah, it takes a better understanding, and you really have to look at the whole system around a goal like that. And so my goal is probably never going to be to grow all my own food. I like having enough variety in my diet that like there's certain types of food that it's just not worth growing for one person, Yeah. You start to get into a glass ceiling of inefficiencies and space and time invested because, certain types of food need a lot of processing. Do you want to winnow and thresh all of your own grains? Do you know how much time that takes, especially if you're not using machinery?
Yeah, I've seen guys like pick wheat and then make their own bread. And even at that, the bread didn't look too good.
Well, that's the thing is like, if you're trying to be good at everything, you're probably not going to be particularly good at any one of those things. Yeah. It's cool to be a generalist to a certain point, but at another point, you want to focus on like, what do you want to do well enough that you can get really good at it and share the surplus in order to make up the shortfall of things that you're not doing for yourself. So like, I can grow a massive garden and I can build my own house, because most of what I did for the last handful of years was actually natural building and not permaculture directly
I've
related.
seen that actually. I didn't ask you about that. I've seen that. It looks really cool. Let's go back to your website real quick.
Well, the cool thing about it is, like, you can apply permaculture design principles to building a house. And that's what I did for about 5 years. And I had built mostly earthen homes in places like the Philippines and Senegal and Guatemala over the last handful of years, but applying permaculture design principles to what we would call zone 0, which is your immediate living environment.
It's so much more diverse than I thought it was.
Have I convinced you that when we get our proper studio going, that we have to have a garden space? Yes. Are you convinced on that now?
I am now convinced that we should have a garden space if we have it when we get a proper studio going.
Oliver, thank you.
There you go.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that.
It was such a pleasure to talk to you guys.
Yeah. I'm showing the website here. If people want to go follow you, they can find you on Instagram as do you know Instagram again?
Abundant Edge is the Instagram account. Abundant_edge is the Instagram. I'm not very active on that, and I'm terrible at it. I don't spend a lot of time on Instagram. I barely saw your message because I don't use the messenger feature very much. If you want to see what I'm doing, I would really recommend joining the Regenerative Skills Facebook group. I post a lot of content to there directly. We also have an email list. The Regenerative Skills email list will give you a new skill, something that you can do in very simple to follow steps that I usually send out once every second week to give you enough time to kind of develop the skill before you get a new one. And of course, the podcast is really where I'm posting every single week. And there I've got interviews with, industry leaders, innovators, people on the cutting edge of the regenerative fields. And though I've done plenty of interviews on permaculture design, especially in the earlier seasons, I'm just now, I think it's going to be about another month and a half of interviews specifically on regenerative agriculture and the way that they've applied it all over the world. So tropics, cold climates, temperate, Mediterranean, whether it's syntropic farming, agroforestry, no-till market gardening, even grain production and holistic grazing methods. And the series coming up after this is regeneration of waterways. So it turns out that our water cycle has actually a lot more to do with the warming of the planet than our carbon cycle. And a lot of people are unaware of this. So you could fix and sequester all of the carbon put into the atmosphere since the Industrial Revolution, and you would still have runaway ecosystem degradation that stands to topple modern civilization if you don't fix the water cycle.
Yeah, I don't realize how at risk we actually are.
Yeah, I don't want to go down that rabbit hole because it gets dark super fast.
But it could get really bad, so start planting your veggies.
Mate, we're on a precipice here, and it goes a lot beyond planting veggies and goes into the restoration of ecosystems that support life, right? Because if you're planting an annual garden that needs you to produce compost from outside inputs and bring in water for irrigation, I promise you that system is just as brittle as, maybe not just as brittle as getting your food from the grocery store, but it's hardly secure. Whereas if you're creating resilient ecosystems that continue to grow in fertility and resilience without your management once they get established, then we're starting to talk about things that will supply food for a growing population while also performing the ecosystem services that can restabilize our climate and our watersheds, which is just as important. And that's where I really want to start to direct the conversation, is that you can do all these little things towards self-sustainability, but you really need to start to see yourself as part of a global ecology, community, and economy. And your role in that is going to really determine where we go as a species in a very short amount of time. And like we mentioned before, we have been an extremely destructive presence and disturbance on this planet for quite a number of years now.
And we can change it.
But we have all of the knowledge, all of the technology, all of the money, all of the willpower and the human resources to turn this around in an incredibly short amount of time in relation to how quickly we got here. But it will require everybody participating. This isn't something that you can do passively. This isn't something that you can wait for somebody else to take the lead on.
Like you
we
can't
really
do
need
it for
everybody's contributions. Yeah. And you know what? The cool thing about it is, like, we don't have anything to lose. There's money to be made in this. You know, there's happiness and improved relationships, resilience, and, you know, basically all of the symptomatic ills of our culture and the direction that we're going as a society can be solved by all of the work that goes into fixing our natural resources. Because like I mentioned before, this requires personal growth. It requires spiritual growth. It requires community growth. And all of these other steps that can fix sort of these symptomatic problems that we're always trying to hit sort of in a whack-a-mole sort of way. If we can fix the baseline, which is scarcity of resources, as sort of the fear factor or the motivation behind so much turmoil that creates these downhill effects, then we can really start to, I guess, move the needle on the progress that needs to be made towards working towards a regenerative future.
Yeah. So, if you want to hear him talk more sciencey stuff, you can find him at the Abundant Egg podcast. No, I'm ashamed, actually, and I don't know if I said it on the podcast or off the podcast. I didn't actually listen to your podcast before this. I'll be straight out about it. But if you want to join me in being a new listener on his podcast, you can find him at the Abundant Edge podcast, and you can take a look at his pretty damn cool website where he's 121 articles about permaculture.
And 166 episodes in 4 seasons of podcasts, I believe. So, like,
not too bad.
Anything that you would want to learn about this, you can find for free if you're willing to dig into those episodes. Like,
that's fun.
There's more than a college level course on anything that you would want to know in the archives there. So, you know, don't even tell me you don't have the money to learn this stuff. It's all there.
Yeah, you can learn anything on YouTube these days, or podcast.
That's the stuff. Well, look, Jared, man, it was such a pleasure. Thanks for making the time. It was really fun to talk to you both. And let's keep in touch. I'm really excited to see how you guys keep growing the podcast and continue to have more interesting conversations. And I want some advice. As if I can get some land, I'm really going to set up an archery range, and I want some pointers.
Of course.
Yeah.
Thank you for coming on and educating me. Being, you know, I had no idea about permaculture before, and
I thought I knew something, by the way. Yeah, I thought I was going in this with a pretty amateur level of understanding.
It was just
I'm a baby compared to what you know about this.
And then both of us were just like, okay, this is
Jesus.
Mate, it's been my lifestyle for like 10 years now. This is like everything that I've been learning about for like a decade in 20 different countries, and so many different projects, from building to gardens to ecosystem restoration to conservation projects to, you know, working with communities and NGOs. Like, if you spend as much time as I did doing this stuff, you'd know more than I would probably.
I could tell you plenty about archery, but
there you go.
It's not my strength.
Everybody's got their strong suit, so I'm really glad that you had me on so that I could talk about all my nerd stuff here.
Thank you so much for getting on.
So,
all right, take care, boys. Good luck to you.
Whoever who listened, make sure to like, comment, subscribe. Have a great day. Take it easy.